So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Fiona Chandler. I'm with Alluvium Consulting. My job here today is to make sure that you get the most out of this hour that we have to spend together and to help answer some of the questions and provide some background information about the project. Before we get going though, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're all meeting on today, particularly on the Sunshine Coast with the Cubby Cubby and the Jinnabara peoples. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I'd like to extend that acknowledgement and respect to any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that are joining us today. Before we get going, Alyssa, if you could just maybe bring up the next slide. There's a few little hints that I'd like to share with you to make sure that you can get the most out of this webinar. At any time today while we're talking, please feel free to add your comments into the chat room. That way we'll keep an eye on that, and when we've got time we'll stop and pause, or simply if you just want to share your ideas, that's a great place to do it. If you do have a question that you'd like us as a panel to respond to, time pending, can you use that Q&A little icon? It means that others can see your questions, and if they, it means that they can actually show us if they want that question asked as well. I'd also like to disclose that we are recording this webinar, and that's so that we can share it with those that are unable to join us today. And we will share that recording at a later date. Before we get going, I'd just like to check in with everyone to see your background, how much you know about the Our Resilient Coast, Our Future project. To do that, I'm just going to throw up a quick little poll. So this is just a snap poll with a question about whether you've actually heard about this project before and just how much you know about it. This will actually just make sure that we can pitch the information at the right level, but it is designed to for a wide range of backgrounds. So if you've never heard of it before, that's what today is all about. So if you'd just like to click on the right answer that best meets your current position. And if you think you can run the webinar, I reckon Steve and Alyssa would be very happy to hand it over, but we won't. Okay, just waiting for a couple more people if you're going to vote. Okay, so I'm just going to share those results with you. And we've got a pretty knowledgeable group here. So that's fantastic that we can really get into some of the detail today. But again, there's no question that's going to be too dumb today. So it's all about you. Okay, Alyssa, I might hand over to you to get going into the first part of the session.
Thanks, Fiona. So hi everyone, I'm Elisa. I've been supporting, heading up the consultant project team that has been assisting Sunshine Coast Council through the development of a coastal hazard adaptation strategy. And we've also got Steve Scull. Steve, did you want to say a quick hello before we get going?
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Steve Scull. As Lisa mentioned, I'm the Regional Manager for Queensland, so I'm lucky enough to kind of get to roam across a few of our coastal hazard projects up and down the Queensland coast. And I also live up in Maleny, so I've got an interest in the project purely from a resident's perspective. So yeah, good to have you along this afternoon.
Thanks, Steve. And so today we wanted to provide for you a bit of a briefing on how the draft strategies come together over the last couple of years and what's broadly what's in the strategy as well, and draw your attention to some of the actions and the themes and the content in the strategy to help you in providing feedback during the current public consultation period that's out now as well, and also give you the opportunity to ask any questions of us as the project team for any clarification on how the strategies come together and what's in it. So I'll give you a bit of background context to start with, and then we'll go from there. The coastal hazard adaptation is it's been happening right across the Queensland coast for the better part of the last 5 years. It's quite an exciting time in Queensland. Queensland's really been leading the charge in equipping coastal councils to do coastal adaptation And this has been largely driven by the state government initiative, the Q Coast 2100 program, which has provided funding and support to over 31 councils so far to participate in developing adaptation strategies. Our Coast, Our Future is Sunshine Coast Council's program or vehicle for developing the coastal hazard adaptation strategy. And the CHAS, as we often refer to it, is also a transformational action that was in the Environment and Livability Strategy key council policy platform. And the strategy, it's a long-term strategy. It's about enabling proactive actions and ways to manage the impacts of coastal hazards. And when we say coastal hazards, we're talking particularly about erosion, so open coast erosion of the beach, as well as inundation, so short temporary inundation with storm tides, or longer term permanent or frequent inundation in tidal areas. It's important to have these strategies for a range of reasons for the communities and all of us. These strategies help reduce erosion and inundation impacts on our beaches, essential community infrastructure, and the coastal areas we use and enjoy. So our coastal hazards are natural processes, but we call them hazards when they impact on how we use and enjoy the coastline. So the strategy is also important to then help protect the values of our coast, particularly in the ways that we adapt in the long term, and improve our own personal and our community resilience to these hazards, our ability to bounce back after events, and also our ability to adapt. So to change what we're doing and change how we're managing the coast into the future as we learn new things about our coastline. In addition, for council, these strategies are quite important to enable, as I mentioned, that proactive planning. That'll be informing asset management programs, a broad range of plans, policies and strategies that council are undertaking, and continuing to build those ongoing partnerships with all our stakeholders and communities. The process to develop the strategy has been going through an 8-phase process. Now, this is a standard process set by the state government to provide a consistent framework for all councils who are doing this planning across the coast. And essentially those 8 phases cover off some early phase work around committing and getting ready and scoping studies for the process. A range of technical studies through the middle part, phases 3 to 5, which look at understanding where our coastal hazard areas are and what might be exposed and at risk, and by when, so from present day and to the future. And then bringing that all together at the back end of the process to start to plan. So looking at different adaptation options, assessing those adaptation options, and then starting to shape that into our strategy, our long-term strategy. So this process takes several years, and for Sunshine Coast, this has been going since around 2017, 2018. And certainly the last 2 years have been the focus of bringing the strategy content, doing all the investigations and bringing their work together into a draft. That draft, as I said before, is out now for public comment, and that public comment period ends at 5 p.m. on Monday, the 7th of December. So really encouraging everybody to jump onto the website and have their say, and we'll talk a bit more about that shortly. So the purpose of today is really to give you an overview of how that document's come together and inform you to provide that feedback and submission and ask any questions. So we will pause as we go along and check the Q&A. So do feel free as we're going along to drop any questions in the Q&A and we'll pick those up as we go. So the draft strategy development, we think about this in terms of 2 components. There has been a engagement component to it and a technical component, but the reality is these have been very integrated. So they've been flowing together throughout the development process over the last 2 years and informing each other as the work's gone along. So the engagement process itself has been quite substantial since 2019. At the core of that process has been our community advisory group. And this has been an independent group chaired by Professor John Martin, which includes representatives from all these different organisations you can see here listed on the screen. And that group's been really important, has met regularly throughout the process, typically every 6 to 8 weeks, and helped inform us shape some of the technical investigations, determine the strategic direction at different components of the project, and test the findings and results and outcomes of the process as we've gone along. There's also been a range of special interest groups briefed along the way, in addition to the community advisory group, agencies and representative groups, and several different approaches for the community engagement as well. There's been 2 main rounds of the community engagement, so hopefully you've been able to attend and be involved in those. Round 1 was April to September, and that was really focused around values and experiences of the coast and coastal hazards, and knowledge sharing around how our coast has always changed over time, from historically, thinking about present day and into the future, and thinking about what will a resilient coast look like in the future, and how do we adapt and respond to coastal hazards in the context of what we want our resilient coast to be. Round 2 was very much around adaptation options and the draft strategy, getting some input into the draft strategy on people's preferences for different types of adaptation options. We had a great response to the survey with over 800 responses to that survey, which was great input into developing some initial thinking on the options. So today we've had over 5,000 people engaging through the website. We've had lots and lots of face-to-face conversations, 2,500, likely more with the current events happening as well. And over 1,200 people completing one or both of the surveys that have been out. Oh, just went backwards, sorry. There we go. And some of the themes coming back to us from the surveys and the conversations and all of the engagement process along the way is that really our resilient coast needs to include elements of balance in how we use and manage the coast, protecting key ecosystems and species, cooperation, sustainability, working with nature being a really strong preference and strong feedback coming back in terms of adaptation options and working with nature. Healthy and functional, accessible being a really important part of the identity of the Sunshine Coast, and a really strong appetite for smart planning and innovation. So there's a range of updates on the website. So I encourage you to have a look at those for any further information or findings on the engagement activities during the process. On the website too is a set of communications material. There's a set of project updates, fact sheets that are also a supplement to the strategy itself. And there's a range of other information in terms of event flyers and what's happening at each stage of the project. In terms of the technical work that's been running alongside the engagement activities, there's really 3 key areas to touch on here. Coastal hazards, so defining which areas or parts of our coast are likely to be prone to coastal hazards now and into the future out to 2100. Thinking about all the different types of assets that may be impacted by those coastal hazard areas, so creating a big asset database that we can use for the analysis, and then running some of that analysis on what's exposed, what's at risk, and by when, and some of the economics that goes with that as well. So I've just got one slide for each of those here to give you a sense of the technical work that's gone into the document. But certainly each slide's probably had about 6 months work sitting behind it. So important to note that there is existing state mapping currently available for erosion prone areas on the state government website. And that's areas that are likely to be prone to open coast erosion, tidal area inundation and storm tide inundation by 2100. So these are our initial maps that were available before the CHAS process began. And part of the work of the CHAS has been to update those maps and provide some additional planning horizons and sensitivity analysis around some of the hazard assessments. So for Sunshine Coast, their coastal hazard mapping includes present day, 2041, 2070, 2100 planning horizons for erosion and storm tide inundation mapping. And then there's a range of sensitivity analysis as well that's looked at different events, big and small events in that. The mapping that's accompanying the draft strategy is available on the website as well. There's quite a handy tool that council have developed, an interactive mapping tool, so you can jump on and have a look and zoom around and look at the different layers of the mapping. The asset database that's been collated has a huge range of different types of assets. So when we're thinking about assets, we're talking about beach and foreshore, buildings and facilities, other infrastructure and utilities, transport, land, cultural and environmental overlays as well, and planning scheme zones. So for Sunshine Coast Council, this is a significant database with over 600,000 features of council data alone, and then utilities have provided a range of their data as well to be included in the assessment process and provided back to them. And so if you think about all our different coastal hazard overlays and all our different data sets, and we effectively overlay the hazard area on top of the spatial data to work out what assets are exposed and at risk and by when. So there's lots of different spatial analysis that goes into that process. Once we have that data assessed, we can then think about, when we know what's exposed, we can think about what's the consequence of that exposure. That gives us our risk. So if something's very likely to be exposed and it has a high consequence of that exposure, that's when we say something's high risk. So our risk assessment is really designed for us to try and identify where those high risk assets are across the whole region. So it's a region-wide assessment. The assessment for the CHAS has been based on best practice, informed by the community advisory group. So we've had subgroups from the CAG helping develop the framework for the risk assessment. Council teams providing input, and importantly, the community perspectives on values and what a resilient coast looks like in the future has informed the consequence assessment. So it's been a tailored approach based on understanding what that community input was from round one. And once we have our risk assessment, we can also look at economics. So we can think about, well, what's going to be the damage cost of those assets being impacted by those different hazards and over time. And that's called our base case. So in the event that we do no additional adaptation or just our business as usual, what's the potential economic damages from an erosion event on a certain asset type in present day, and then by 2100. So that gives us a sense of our cost ranges that we might be looking at if we don't intervene. And then there's a range of additional analysis we do for the strategy to look at multi-criteria, cost benefit and thresholds and case studies to work out, well, what is the benefit of us intervening and doing additional adaptation actions? How much do we reduce that cost? And what's our economic benefit for a whole range of factors from doing adaptation? It gives us our business case for adaptation in the future. So bringing all that technical and the strategic work together, they have hand in hand informed the development of the draft strategy that we have now. And that draft we fully anticipate will be continued to be revised through the public and certainly after the public consultation period. So very keen to get everybody's feedback to help do the final shaping of that document over the coming months. I'll pause there and we can, Fee, I think we have a poll and we might check the Q&A.
Thanks, Alyssa. So just while we do wait to see if you have any questions on what Alyssa's covered so far in the briefing, just add that to the chat or the Q&A. But I would love to find out a little bit more about who that's on the webinar today may have participated in some of that engagement. So we're really interested just to get a little bit of feedback. So if you wouldn't mind having a look at the question I've just launched now. So we're just interested if any of you have participated in any of those engagement activities over that last sort of 2 years, 18 months that we were talking about. Some of them, certainly pre-COVID, were many personal in-person events. We've also done a range of virtual ones like we are today, and special briefings to certain groups in person, and those surveys, or maybe today's the first element you've actually been able to engage in. Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to end that poll now. and I'll share those results. So pretty good mix. And great that those people have been able to join us today for this event, and hopefully looking at the draft strategy as well. So Alyssa, I'm not seeing any other questions come up yet. So what we might do is keep going on, and then that might give us a little bit more time after this next section.
Sure. So that was a bit about how the strategies come.
Sorry, Alyssa, can I actually pause you there?
Yeah.
Just before we do move on. Steve, we've got a question there around what other council strategies were used as input in terms of other parts of the Sunshine Coast planning world. Would you like just to do respond to that one?
Yeah, sure. Look, it's a really broad range of council strategies and policies. So the project teams being out of has worked with a whole range of groups across council, and we've done some quite deep, what we call deep dive sessions with each of those groups. So we've worked with groups like the planning scheme team, people working on particular projects, people from the flooding and stormwater management team. So we've had quite detailed conversations with those teams, and I guess they've helped us, they've helped inform both the region-wide and the locality-specific strategies that we've come up with as a result of those conversations. And I guess it's also enabled in reverse those teams to take away some of the key thinking from the CHAS as it's being developed to help better inform their projects. So that might help to answer that question.
And I guess, Steve, some of those conversations are still going on as
and to answer that second question, yes, they definitely included the mass transit team. We had quite detailed conversations with those guys.
Great, thanks, Steve. Alyssa, do you want to keep going down our journey?
Sure, will do. So that was a little bit about the development process of the strategy, and certainly if any more questions come to mind around that, do drop them in the Q&A. We'll come back to them. Now I just wanted to talk you through a bit of an overview of the draft strategy itself. So hopefully you might have had a chance to have a look at it, but if not, this is intended to give you a bit of a snapshot of some of the key components of that document as well. So the draft strategy itself certainly has a whole lot of background context around coastal hazards and coastal adaptation. So today we're jumping towards the back of the strategy. We're going to talk about the framework for adaptation and the actions in the strategy itself. So the framework for adaptation is tailored for Sunshine Coast Council CHAS. And effectively, when we're talking about adaptation, we often talk about an adaptation response, a strategic response for different locations based on the risk profile in different areas. And we also talk about adaptation options or actions, the things that we can do to achieve that response. So our adaptation responses, we have three. The first one is monitor, maintain and prepare. So this is relevant in areas where we have relatively low coastal hazard risk present day. However, we are continuing to monitor that risk profile in case as it may change over time. And also maintaining existing arrangements and doing any necessary preparation for potential future actions that we can see might need to be implemented in future planning horizons. So monitor, maintain and prepare is our first response. In other areas where we have a higher coastal hazard risk or an emerging coastal hazard risk, we may have a mitigate response. And this essentially means we are actively mitigating or actively doing things to reduce that risk, that coastal hazard risk. We can be doing things to reduce the likelihood of something being exposed to coastal hazards, or we can be actively reducing the consequence, or both. So there's a range of adaptation actions that we can do to mitigate coastal hazard risk. And typically we'll continue to do those actions until there's a trigger or a strategic reason to shift to the next response, which we call a transition response. And this is our strategic decision to effectively transition or change how we're using the land in coastal hazard prone areas. And mitigation may be part of the process. It's usually a long-term planning process towards a transition. And it often can apply to just localized areas within particular parts of the coast, or potentially broader areas that may be prone to broader scale coastal hazard risk increases in the future. So in the bottom of the slide there, you can see a couple of example sites about how we apply adaptation response, just to 3 example sites. And you can see in the present day, we have an adaptation response, and then that response changes into the future. And the change is informed by our appreciation of how the risk profile is changing from the technical work done previously, and a range of other location-specific factors as well for each locality. So in the strategy, there's pathways set out for each individual locality. The range of actions we can then do to achieve those responses, and certainly there's a big focus on the present day actions, but also thinking about what might need to be done in the future. There's 4 themes identified in the strategy: enhancing adaptive capacity, coastal management and engineering, planning, and modifying infrastructure. So we have a range of actions under each of these themes. Important to note that the strategy itself encompasses the whole coast. So there's been no areas left out. It's all localities. That spans around 4 indicative zones that's informed some of our analysis. And there's 28 location-based pathways or localities, or often referred to as beach units. They coincide with the same beach units used in the Shoreline Erosion Management Plan. So there's that direct link for the CHAS to inform future Shoreline Erosion Management Plan updates and actions as well. So for our 4 themes, I'll just touch on the key actions in each of those themes now. Enhancing adaptive capacity is certainly one of the foundational themes for the strategy. Really important to underpin adaptation planning long term. And certainly community stewardship is one of our core sub-themes, if you like. We have a range of actions in the strategy that focus on enhancing dune protection and maintenance, and enhancing social adaptive capacity. 2 really key elements that have come through strongly from community engagement and discussions with the community environment group. The importance of the dune network is significant for providing that long-term natural buffer for coastal hazards for many parts of the coast. So really important to protect and enhance that dune system wherever possible will significantly reduce potential future risk. Enhancing social adaptive capacity is about understanding where our vulnerable communities are and what other ways that we might be able to support businesses to be and communities to be more resilient and recover and manage the potential impacts of coastal hazards in the long term. Knowledge sharing is really key, and this includes continuing conversations and partnerships that have already begun with our traditional owners in coastal management and adaptation. Developing some cross-agency networks and continuing those. Training, education and communication materials, particularly important for communicating a range of initiatives in the strategy. Monitoring, Sunshine Coast Council have a substantial monitoring program already underway that informs the Shoreline Erosion Management Plan and other activities on the coast. So it will really be about updating and ensuring that the monitoring programs can help inform the CHAS implementation and evaluation process over time, and some new initiatives for enhancing data management and evaluation through that process. And research partnerships. Certainly been some good conversations already happening through with different research institutions, particularly University of Sunshine Coast, around opportunities for adaptation specific studies into the future that have benefit for the Sunshine Coast. Coastal management engineering is our second theme. And as I mentioned, the Shoreline Erosion Management Plan is one of the key mechanisms for implementing a lot of the coastal engineering related works along the Sunshine Coast LGA. And certainly the CHAS links in strongly with this and includes some clarification on the timing and sequencing of adaptation actions in the long term, beyond the 10-year life of a shoreline erosion management plan. So we'll be able to help inform and guide those updates to the SEMP in the future. And region-wide assessments, there's been a range of those that have been identified through the CHAS development process. Ones that are needed to help inform future engineering adaptation options, and to review those pathways as we continually adapt how we manage the coast over time. And certainly embedding alignment with drainage and other planning directions within council has been a big part of looking at the coastal management and engineering actions as well. And as Steve mentioned, lots of discussions internally with all the different council teams involved in that process. Some of those region-wide assessments, just to give you a sense of them, include this region-wide sand nourishment program. So building off the initial work of the sand sourcing study that's been completed, starting to look at implementing that and some pilot site implementation in the coming years. A surf break strategy to ensure that the way we're managing the coast, including when doing nourishment activities, is enhancing and not impacting on our asset of the surf break itself. Some other particular investigations around rocky headlands and estuary entrance management, management of waterfront assets and the constructed water bodies, and stormwater and drainage upgrades. And also things like considering our local ecosystem responses and what some specific adaptation needs might be for those local ecosystem needs, which can be certainly complex and require some special site-specific investigation. And reviewing surf life-saving infrastructure and services across the coast as well, with these being almost exclusively located in coastal hazard prone areas, thinking about how to adapt some of that infrastructure over time. And there's a range of other ones as well. So do encourage you to have a look at the strategy and think about if there's anything missing or any other ideas or initiatives that you would propose to add into the mix. Our third of four things, planning. There's a range of actions in the strategy around developing some special area adaptation plans. This is particularly to inform asset planning and location or transition planning at the specific areas where it's been noted that these actions are flagged for the future. And you can see where those areas are in the different adaptation pathways in the strategy. So this is about doing some of that site-specific planning for those locations. And then there's also reviewing some planning provisions to ensure that the way we're using our land use in the hazard, particularly existing hazard-prone areas, is suitable in the long term, and that our long-term pathways, that planning provisions are enabling adaptation, particularly in our inundation-prone areas. Final theme is modifying infrastructure. And this is looking at embedding asset exposure and risk, particularly into council's existing asset management systems. So there's a range of existing systems and processes in place. And this is about ensuring that all this new information is embedded and is informing upgrades and planning in the future. There's also a range of site-specific actions that will follow on from some of the special area planning in terms of where we're locating assets in the coastal hazard area in the future. And informing other specific infrastructure planning, including bigger scale strategic planning across the coast. So the draft actions, there's currently around 50 of these region-wide actions in the strategy across those four themes, and some specific applications across our 28 localities. So I do encourage you to go and at least particularly have a look at the localities that are important to you. And provide feedback on the timing, the appropriateness of the actions, or any other thinking that you'd like to provide into shaping those final pathways. And certainly the pathways are adaptive, they're reviewed over time, and in essence, it's the start of the process to continually then review and adapt the strategy. I think I'll pause there, and B, back to you.
Thanks, Alyssa. Again, a big chunk of information there. And before we talk about where you could actually find more about how to get more details on that, we'll just have a quick look. I can't see any questions coming in at the moment, so that's either good news or they're just going to hold them over to the face-to-face briefings and open house sessions maybe. It's all quiet. Well, Steve, maybe you could just expand a bit more on where people can answer perhaps very specific questions about their local areas, or how they can actually give the project team further feedback on the draft.
Sure, thank you, Fee. So we've touched on this a little bit as we've gone through, but it's obviously really important for us as the project team and council to be able to get more feedback from everybody during this public consultation phase. So one of the key ways you can do that is to jump onto the website. So if you can quickly find the Have Your Say portal and then move through to our Resilient Coast, Our Future site, and you'll find a range of information there that enables you to do something very simple, from type an email to the project team to do a more detailed and formal structured response to the strategy in its draft form. So there's a process to step you through that. You'll also find obviously all the information there, the draft strategy itself, and that's supported by 3 main supplements, a set of fact sheets to help explain some of the processes and information behind the development of the strategy, the mapping that Elise has already talked about, and the interactive mapping tool, so you can zoom around the Sunshine Coast and have a look at the bits of the coast that are of most interest to you, and some summaries for each of the adaptation options that we consider in the strategy itself. So a range of information there, a lot of information, and as I said, there's tools on the website to enable you to do anything from a simple response via email to a formal letter to a formal guided submission on the feedback form. So there's actually a feedback form that'll step you a bit like a SurveyMonkey type approach to actually help you build a submission, or you can actually go the full hog and give us a really detailed submission, and we'd love to get that as well. So we've got some other ways you can communicate with us as the project team. We've been out and about already up in Mullaney, and last week on Friday we had a good session with quite a few people at the North Shore Community Centre. There's 2 more of those coming up on Thursday this week, both down in one at Caloundra and then at Boccarina, so you can see the times and places, and that information is all on the website as well. But that's a chance to come and look at the maps, talk to one of the project team, talk to some of the council staff, watch a video, ask us questions. It'll be great to see you at one of those. And I guess the other important point to make is that this is really the start of the adaptation process. So the strategy is designed to be reviewed every 5 to 10 years, and that can be, triggered by new information that's really important, or just, the need for a review itself in a regular time frame. So the adaptation pathway should continually change over time and be informed by better and new information as it comes to hand, and the monitoring and evaluation that goes along the way. So very much the start of the journey for the implementation process linked to the strategy. And I think we've touched on some of those ways you can help provide us with some feedback, but there's a range of ways people can individually help us in relation to adaptation and building capacity across the region. So obviously providing us with feedback would be great. Improving your knowledge, if you don't have it already, around what those coastal hazards look like in your particular areas of interest, and you can use the mapping to do that, or have a look at the locality specific summaries that Elisa touched on before. Have a look at the pathway that we've suggested as an adaptation pathway for that area of interest. For areas where we know that there's going to be some challenges around housing, there's some good tips there for resilient houses and how people can make their homes more resilient into the future. And obviously contributing to the future stewardship of those important areas. And we've had some great conversations with people who do that already in the open house sessions. So I'll just have a look, jump back into the questions. There's one there about planning. There's a couple linked to the planning scheme, I suppose. One question there around the planning scheme amendments. So the CHAS teams work closely with the planners in council to look at the planning scheme in its current form. I guess my sense would be, and Elisa, you might want to help with this one, but my sense would be that CHAS will largely inform future planning scheme amendments. It's very much a forward-looking document. We get similar questions asked about particular development applications currently working their way through council and that kind of thing as well. And this project doesn't really have the ability to influence those. It's very much a forward-looking future planning document, so it will inform future iterations of the planning scheme rather than current processes that are underway, would be my general sense of a response to those. There's also one in there about how obligated council are to adhere to the recommendations, which is a pretty good question. I think that's a challenge for any council. So this project, like others running across council, will throw up a series of actions that council need to deliver in collaboration with other people. It's not all for council to deliver. So there will be some actions that are absolutely relevant to the planning scheme and the future planning and future area planning. So this throws up the need for some very specific local area planning, that sort of specialised adaptation planning for particular areas, and that's articulated in those locality specific plans. But I guess there's a real need for council to be able to deliver everything that's in this strategy, to be able to partner with not just other levels of government, but some of the utilities who've provided us with their data and the broader community, so that council won't be able to deliver all of the actions in the strategy on its own. In some cases, all it can do is coordinate and help deliver some of those projects. Some of those planning projects are a good example of those. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Elisa. I've tried to roam across those three questions.
Yeah, I was just having a think about them too. Yeah, certainly. It's probably important to note that CHAS isn't a statutory document in itself. So I think, yeah, its role is to inform and provide information to the other statutory planning processes that will be running through council. There are already a range of planning controls and things in place for parts of the erosion prone area that are also state controls as well. So there's certainly things in place already. And then a lot of the long-term planning and actions in the CHAS itself are about strategically planning to reduce that risk into the future through a lot of different incremental change and actions, but also as well as informing the bigger strategies and planning processes in council.
Yep. Thanks, Elisa. There's also a question that's specific to particular areas. In the planning updates, we talk about avoiding development in high-risk inundation or erosion-prone areas, and maybe could we provide some specific examples of those?
Yeah, so I think that probably touches on so the erosion-prone area, the open coast component of the erosion-prone area, which in the coastal hazard mapping looks sort of like that pinky purple band down the coast. So typically anywhere, within that 2100 open coast erosion prone area, the general, state directed premise is to avoid development in those areas of assets that can't be readily relocated or removed into the future. So that applies to a whole lot of different localities across the coast. So I wouldn't want to pick out just one now, but certainly that's probably one of the key directions around avoiding development in some of those risk mapped areas.
Yep. Elisa, could I just reiterate that some of those more really locally specific questions is the perfect reason, if you can get to one of those face-to-face, to meet both with council staff as well as members of our project team, to really talk about very individual cases or situations. So I would recommend anyone get along to that and have those more personal one-on-one conversations.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing I'd add, there's a question there that's linked to some of the current amendments of the planning scheme. I sort of touched on that a little bit, but the CHAS, while it's a future focused document, does have the ability, I suppose, as those consultation processes come back into council and get reconsidered before they're finalised, to influence some of those while they are progressing would be the other way to look at it as well.
Just got another one there, Steve, around erosion prone areas. I'm not sure if that's you or Alyssa? Bit around densification.
Yeah, I think that's probably, Steve could probably add to this, but that's, yeah, I think there's a whole range of different things and factors that council will be processing based on the outcomes of the CHAS, plus a whole lot of other strategic planning considerations across the coast that tend to influence those site-specific decisions. So what we do want to ensure is that decision making, or we want to encourage that decision making is consistent with the long-term adaptation pathway for different localities. And then there's a range of detailed consideration that goes into that as well.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I'd add is that the ultimate aim from the state government's perspective with the CHAS, the outputs from this process is to take that updated mapping and ultimately make that become the state mapping. So ultimately, you could argue that would then become, linked more clearly to things like state planning policy, which is then obviously going to guide future planning schemes. So I think that's the other really important way that the information from this project can have a much longer term and more lasting outcome.
We've still got a little bit of, oh, sorry, Alyssa. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to clarify, Fee, that the strategy itself too is very much around, identifying areas of coastal hazard exposure and risk and implications and opportunities for adaptation in the future. And that's the focus of this strategy, which will then inform planning policy along with a whole range of other factors as well down the track.
We've still got a few more minutes. I think the draft process is very much to share the current thinking, but this consultation process is also to get a sense from the broader community about those strategies, whether we've missed things, whether there's different preferences or perhaps different priorities. So that's also a core purpose of this engagement period. So if you haven't heard about things that you think should be there, then again, this is the time to be letting us know. Although in saying that, this is always a constant process. So the opportunities don't end with this strategy. There's a whole way of, different processes that will continue on as these different initiatives become, relevant and can be implemented. So we're very keen to make sure this is seen as one in a big toolbox of adaptation tools and plans. But we certainly want to get as much right as we can at this point.
There's a question there in relation to the timing of the project.
Yep.
So we've obviously got the strategy out for consultation until early December, but so the process from there is obviously to look at all that feedback and how we need to modify and improve the strategy as a result. And then ultimately the strategy will be, weaving its way as a final document up through council-related processes in around February next year, as I currently understand it, to be finalised for endorsement.
And all Queensland coastal hazard plans that are currently being developed will all be wrapping up around that same February, March timeframe. Alyssa, there's one more question there that I might direct to you. It's regarding reference to you talked about the drainage studies, and it's a really important part of this. How will the council be, or current understanding of how council will integrate these two elements of work together?
Yeah, thanks, Fee. So we've had, as Steve mentioned before, what we call deep dive discussions. So a lot of detailed discussions around the CHAS work along with the drainage and stormwater teams within council and the master drainage planning that's also underway. And so the adaptation pathways presented in the draft strategy are a product of having had those conversations and starting to think through and map out how the drainage upgrades and changes into the future would link into the adaptation pathways. So it's certainly an ongoing conversation and review process, and I think will be further refined with all the feedback as well.
And I do know that some of the flood management team representatives will be at those open house sessions. Again, if there's a specific concern or issue that people are interested in talking about. Well, we've only got a few minutes left, but while people might think of a final question, I'd like a little bit more feedback from yourselves. So I'm just going to launch a final poll. And really, there's just two questions there. We're just interested in whether this has perhaps sparked your interest to submit or make a response to the draft. And a second question, a little bit just, has this been useful? I will let you know that there's also a video explainer that is available on Council's Have Your Say site for this project. It's something that you might like to forward to your colleagues. It gives a further explanation about the process that we've undertaken and the purpose of this. So it's a really nice background and explanation of the process if you'd like to have a look at that, and those other communication materials. So please forward those to any colleagues or peers that you think need to know about it. That would be appreciated. This is a really important time, but it's also a busy time, so we get that. Okay, if that's everyone who's going to vote, I'll end that and I'll just show you those responses. I'll come back. We've got just one question pop up. I'll just share these results first. So we've got some people making a submission. Some people are happy with what they've heard so far. And that's great that there's still concerns. Hopefully there's still some opportunities for you to ask and clarify some of that. Or if not, that's the time to let the project team know by way of a submission. So I appreciate that feedback. And Steve, it looks like you've already been able to answer that question.
Yeah, there was just a bit of feedback there from someone about the ability to actually access the document and sometimes having trouble with the link. So I just said, look, we'll take that up with the council staff and have a look at that as quickly as we can so we don't have that problem.
Excellent. Okay, then in that case, I'd like to thank you all again for sharing this hour with us. We appreciate you're busy. Lots of other opportunities still before that early December timeframe. So we might see or run into you again soon. Thank you. We'll stay on for another minute if you have any other final questions. Otherwise, have a great day.